Hey, it's Alex from Last Climb, and today I'm uncovering the Everest climb where a man reached the summit and came back down to find his oxygen stolen. Greed and panic above 27,000 feet turned 3 cash bottles into the cruelest thing the death zone has ever produced. And trust me, what I uncovered about that descent made this the hardest climb I've ever had to cover. It was May 18th, 2017, and the south col of Mount Everest sat under a sky so clear it looked fake. The wind had dropped to 15 miles per hour, unusual for 26,000 feet, where gusts regularly exceeded 60, and the late afternoon sun threw long shadows across a landscape that resembled a frozen landfill more than a mountain. Abandoned oxygen bottles lay half buried in wind-packed snow. Shredded tent fabric flapped from bent poles. A single boot, origin unknown, sat upright near a rock outcrop, as though its owner had simply stepped out of it and walked away. Somewhere downslope, a torn stuff sack skittered across the ice in short bursts, pushed by wind that couldn't decide on a direction. The South Col was not a place that inspired awe. It was a staging ground where climbers waited to either reach the highest point on Earth or discover they couldn't. From the research I did on this one, the South Col might be the most depressing place on the planet that people pay $70,000 to visit. Among the clusters of tents, Ethan Mercer sat inside his shelter, reviewing a laminated route card he had already memorized. He was 35, a structural engineer from Bozeman, Montana, with 8 years of serious climbing behind him. He had summited Denali twice, once in winter conditions that turned back 2 other teams, along with Cho Oyu and Manaslu. From everything I could find about him, he approached mountains the way he approached load-bearing calculations, with margins built into every plan and redundancies for the redundancies. Friends described him as the kind of person who checked the backup, then checked the backup's backup, then apologized for being cautious. Honestly, when we compared him to the other climbers I've covered, he's really the best kind of climber you can actually root for. This was his second attempt at Everest. The previous year, he had turned back from the balcony at 27,600 feet when a weather system moved in faster than forecast. The decision cost him $40,000 and a year of preparation, but he made it without hesitation. Climbers who knew him said the turnaround told you more about Ethan than any summit would. He came back in 2017 not because he needed the mountain for validation, but because he believed in finishing what conditions had interrupted. And I think that distinction matters, because what comes later hits differently when you understand he wasn't chasing ego. He just wanted to finish something. His expedition was run by a well-regarded mid-tier company. The lead guide, a veteran Kiwi named Ian Hargreaves, enforced turnaround protocols that some clients considered excessive. Ethan had chosen the company specifically for those protocols. His assigned Sherpa was Sonam Thendu, 36, from Tame Village in the Khumbu Valley. Sonam had summited Everest 12 times over 15 years, a record built on quiet competence rather than speed. He was known as a technical climber, better on mixed terrain and route finding than many Sherpas who were faster on straightforward ice. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Tame, and the income from this season was earmarked for his older daughter's school enrollment in Kathmandu. 2 more guiding seasons, enough saved for tuition, then a transition to lower altitude trekking work. The plan was specific. Ethan and Sonam had developed an efficient dynamic over the preceding weeks. Ethan listened to advice, carried weight without complaint, and never treated Sonam as a servant. Sonam offered the kind of candid assessments he reserved for clients he trusted. Ian Hargreaves had paired them deliberately, knowing both men operated on similar frequencies. And I want you to keep that dynamic in mind as this unfolds. Camped nearby on the South Col was a smaller expedition run by a budget operator out of Kathmandu. Adequate permits, basic logistics, fewer Sherpas per client, and a pricing structure that attracted climbers willing to accept reduced support for lower fees. Their oxygen supply had been a topic of quiet concern among other expeditions since the rotation phase. Several Sherpas from competing teams had noted the budget group's balcony cache appeared smaller than their client count required for a safe round trip. The observation circulated the way most observations did on Everest, noted, discussed privately, and ultimately treated as someone else's problem. Regular viewers of this channel have seen that exact pattern before, and it never ends well. Among that expedition's clients was Nikolai Voronov, 41, a Russian businessman who had arrived at base camp with expensive gear, a personal photographer who turned back at Camp 2, and a confidence that exceeded his experience. He had climbed Elbrus and 1 Himalayan trekking peak, credentials that technically qualified him for a permit, but left significant gaps in death zone preparation. Nikolai is also a prime example of someone whose ego might even be higher than Everest itself. himself. Later statements I found stated he had been loud at base camp, dismissive of weather delays, and vocal about summit ambitions in ways that suggested he viewed the mountain as an obstacle to be purchased through rather than respected. On the afternoon of May 18th, the budget expedition's lead Sherpa was overheard discussing oxygen logistics with visible concern. The conversation, relayed later by Sherpas from other teams, centered on whether their supply was adequate for all clients if the descent ran long. The concern was noted, but nothing was done, and I want you to let that sit for a second. At roughly 12:15 a.m. on May 19th, Ethan and Sonam departed Camp 4 into darkness, broken only by headlamps stretching up the triangular face. The cold was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill, the kind of temperature that turned exposed skin white within minutes and made every metallic surface a contact hazard. Ethan's oxygen mask fogged with each exhale, requiring him to clear condensation from his goggles at regular intervals. His world narrowed to the pool of light from his headlamp, the fixed rope under his ascender, and the rhythm of the step-breathe-step that kept his body generating heat. Other climbers were visible only as bobbing lights above and below, disconnected from bodies, from identities, from anything that resembled human connection. Nobody spoke unless they had to. The effort of forming words at that altitude was a tax most climbers refused to pay. From my knowledge, communication mostly happened through gestures, through the tension on a shared rope, through the pace of the person ahead. The mountain had stripped language down to its most basic function: warning, direction, survival. Everything else was wasted breath, and breath was the one currency no one could afford to waste. The climbing was steep but systematic, and honestly really scary from the pictures and videos I found online. Hard snow and occasional rock, each step placed with the deliberate precision that altitude demanded. Above 26,000 feet, the body consumed itself, muscles breaking down faster than they could repair, cognitive function degrading with every hour. The supplemental oxygen kept Ethan functional, but functional at extreme altitude was a relative term. His thoughts moved slower than at sea level, his reactions lagged. The margin between competent climbing and fatal error was thinner than at any point in his life. They reached the balcony at approximately 4:20 a.m. The small platform at 27,600 feet was crowded with climbers resting, swapping oxygen bottles, and adjusting equipment under headlamp beams that crossed and scattered like searchlights. Ethan and Sonam located their cache, 3 bottles marked with blue electrical tape tucked against a distinctive rock outcrop on the platform's eastern edge. Sonam checked each bottle's pressure gauge, confirmed they were full, and noted their exact position relative to the rock. These bottles were their descent insurance. The ones they carried would get them to the summit and partway back. The cache would carry them the rest of the way to Camp 4. Ethan swapped to a fresh bottle. They continued climbing. So, at this point, their descent oxygen is cached, confirmed, and waiting. I need you to remember that, because it's the last time you're going to have any room to breathe. The budget expeditions team had departed Camp 4 30 minutes earlier, and their climbers were visible as slow-moving lights above. Ethan's group passed several of them between the balcony and the south summit, Nikolai among them, moving with the heavy gait of someone at the edge of his capacity. His Sherpa was close behind, monitoring with the tense posture of a guide who knew his client was fading. Ethan registered the sight without commentary. Everyone above 27,000 feet looked like they were suffering. From what I found, at least 2 of the budget team's clients were already running below safe oxygen margins on the way up. And trust me, that detail becomes important. The south summit arrived at around 8:05 a.m., a false peak at 28,700 feet, marking the beginning of the most exposed terrain on the route. The Hillary step beyond it created a bottleneck where climbers queued in single file, burning oxygen and body heat while waiting for those ahead to clear the near vertical pitch of rock and ice. Ethan and Sonam waited 40 minutes, frustrating but expected. Summit day traffic was a known variable, built into every realistic timeline. When their turn came, they moved through efficiently, Sonam leading and Ethan following with practiced footwork. The final summit ridge was a walk in the sky, narrow, exposed, and beautiful in ways photographs could never convey. The curvature of the earth was visible on the horizon, peaks that would dominate any other landscape. Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu sat below them, reduced to lesser points in a panorama spanning hundreds of miles. Ethan Mercer reached the summit of Mount Everest at exactly 10:48 a.m. on May 19, 2017. He stood at 29,029 feet with Sonam beside him. Sonam took photographs. Ethan held a small American flag for the camera. The celebration was restrained, a handshake, a few minutes absorbing the view, a quiet acknowledgement that the thing was done. Ian Hargreaves had been explicit. 15 minutes maximum at the summit, then descend. They began descending at around 11:12 a.m. The timeline was disciplined, the execution clean. Everything that mattered was below them now. He did everything right. I want to be clear about that before what comes next. Traffic slowed them on the descent through the Hillary Step and Cornice Ridge. Climbers still ascending, while summit teams tried to descend on the same fixed ropes. The single-lane sections created delays that accumulated in minutes, but cost hours. They reached the balcony at approximately 2:40 p.m. Later than ideal, but within acceptable range. The platform was emptier now, the afternoon sun having softened the snow surface. Boot prints from the morning partially erased by wind. Sonam walked to the rock outcrop where they had cached 3 bottles 10 hours earlier. He stopped, looked around, walked to a second outcrop nearby, checking whether his memory had shifted during the long hours above. It had not. He returned to the original spot and crouched, brushing snow with his gloved hand, as though the bottles might somehow be buried just beneath the surface. Bottles were already gone, and my heart sank when I read that in the report. The snow was disturbed, compressed and scuffed in patterns consistent with someone kneeling, handling objects, and standing. Boot prints overlapped in the churned surface, but on a platform where dozens of climbers had passed, individual tracks were meaningless. 3 full oxygen bottles, enough to carry both men safely to Camp 4, had vanished. Sonam checked Ethan's current bottle, roughly 70 minutes remaining at current flow. Camp 4 sat at least 3.5 hours below, possibly 4 given softening snow, and Ethan's accumulated fatigue from 15 hours of climbing. The math was not complicated. It was lethal. Sonam radioed Camp 4. Ian Hargreaves responded within minutes, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Spare oxygen existed at Camp 4, but sending bottles uphill required a Sherpa to climb 800 vertical feet at an altitude where every step cost 10 breaths. Even if someone departed immediately, delivery would take 90 minutes, time Ethan did not have. Other teams on the route were contacted. Every team descending had allocated their oxygen to their own clients. No one had surplus at 27,600 feet. The economy of the death zone was zero sum. Believe me, there's no borrowing up there, no favors, no spare anything. If you don't have it, it doesn't exist. What happened to those bottles was never established with certainty. Climbers who descended through the balcony ahead of Ethan's team later reported seeing a figure crouched near the eastern rock outcrop, wearing a suit consistent with the budget expedition's gear. Nikolai's team had passed through roughly 90 minutes before Ethan and Sonam arrived, descending after a summit push that had strained their oxygen supply to its limits. The budget expedition's post-season inventory showed discrepancies. More empty bottles returned to base camp than their supply chain could account for. But at 27,600 feet in goggles and oxygen masks, identification was unreliable, and the alternative explanation lingered. Someone on that team, running critically low, saw bottles sitting unguarded in the snow and made the calculation that their survival outweighed someone else's planning. Whether it was theft born from greed or desperation, born from fear, the result was identical. Ethan was stranded above 27,000 feet with 70 minutes of oxygen and a 4-hour descent. That right there is what stays with me the most about this story, because it almost doesn't matter why they took them. The outcome was already written. Sonam reduced Ethan's flow rate immediately, buying perhaps another 20 minutes. They needed to move fast, but moving fast burned more oxygen, and moving slow meant more time at altitude where the body deteriorated regardless of pace. Every variable was in conflict. They descended. For 40 minutes, the system held. Ethan moved steadily on fixed ropes. Crampon placements deliberate, breathing controlled. Sonam stayed close, watching for the signs of cognitive decline that preceded collapse. Hesitation at clip points, missed steps, failure to respond to verbal cues. At approximately 3:25 p.m., Ethan's oxygen ran out. The flow through his mask stopped, and within minutes, the difference was visible. His pace dropped. His movements lost coordination. He stopped at an anchor point and stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the rope in front of him, as though he had forgotten what it was for. His hands fumbled at the carabiner connecting him to the fixed line, not with urgency, but with the slow confusion of someone whose brain could no longer sequence simple motor tasks. His fingers closed around the metal and then released it without completing the action, repeating the motion twice before his arm dropped to his side. The wind pushed against him and he swayed slightly. His center of balance balance, drifting in a way that would have alarmed any observer. But at that altitude, in that moment, the only observer was Sonam. Sonam removed his own bottle and connected it to Ethan's regulator. The transfer took less than a minute, a practiced motion executed with the efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this contingency. The decision meant Sonam was now climbing without supplemental oxygen at 27,000 feet, relying on 15 years of conditioning to keep functional long enough to get his client down. And honestly, I've said it time and time again, but most of the Sherpas I've covered really are superhuman, both inside and out. The oxygen steadied Ethan. His pace resumed. For 20 minutes, both men descended in something resembling controlled urgency. Sonam's conditioning held, steps slower, breathing heavier, but coordination intact. Every 100 feet of descent added fractionally more oxygen to each breath. The question was whether the fractions accumulated fast enough. They didn't. 40 minutes after surrendering his oxygen, Sonam's pace faltered, his steps shortened, his rest stops lengthened. The cold, which supplemental oxygen had helped resist by maintaining metabolic heat, penetrated his layering. His fingers stiffened inside his gloves. His thoughts began arriving a half-beat late. The familiar onset of hypoxia that he had trained himself to recognize in clients but had rarely experienced in his own body. I want you to imagine being aware enough to diagnose what's killing you but not able to stop it. That part is hard to sit with. Simultaneously, Ethan's condition deteriorated despite the supplemental flow. He had been above 26,000 feet for over 16 hours. The period without oxygen had inflicted damage that supplemental flow could slow, but not reverse. His legs trembled with each step. His responses to Sonam's cues arrived seconds late, each delay longer than the one before. At approximately 26,100 feet, Ethan stopped on the fixed rope. Sonam called out. No response. He closed the distance and found Ethan standing with his weight entirely on the rope. Legs no longer supporting him, eyes open but unfocused behind snow-crusted goggles. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and irregular, the pattern of a body that had stopped prioritizing consciousness. This is the part where I had to take a breather before continuing the report, but Ethan then collapsed entirely. The sudden dead weight yanked the line taut. Sonam braced, but the shock pulled him off stance. His right crampon caught on a rock ledge beneath the ice, and his ankle torqued sideways with a force that sent pain from foot to knee. Both men slid roughly 15 feet before the fixed rope caught them. Sonam's ankle was broken. He could feel the joint swelling inside his boot, the grinding wrongness when he tried to shift weight onto it. He anchored Ethan to the fixed line with a sling and radioed Camp 4. Two Sherpas from a neighboring expedition began climbing toward them with oxygen and emergency equipment. Estimated arrival, 90 minutes. 90 minutes at 26,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, with a fractured ankle and dropping temperatures, beside a client who was no longer conscious. Sonam wrapped Ethan in an emergency bivouac shell and positioned himself beside the unconscious climber as a windbreak. The temperature dropped through the -20s and kept falling. His fingers lost sensation within 30 minutes. His toes followed, a spreading numbness that started at the tips and moved inward, each nerve going quiet in sequence like lights shutting off down a corridor. The frostbite was not a risk. It was already happening, ice crystals forming in tissue that would never fully recover. He stayed. For 93 minutes, Sonam Thendu sat on an ice slope at 26,000 feet beside an unconscious client, without oxygen. With a broken ankle and fingers he could no longer feel, waiting for help. He could not be certain would arrive. I don't have the words for that kind of loyalty. I genuinely don't. The rescue Sherpas reached them at 6:48 p.m. They administered oxygen and began lowering Ethan toward Camp 4, a 2-hour process complicated by darkness, the angle, and his dead weight. Ethan was placed in a tent at approximately 9:15 p.m. Oxygen was administered at maximum flow. His core temperature was dangerously low, his breathing barely perceptible, his pupils fixed and unresponsive. Ethan Mercer died inside the tent at Camp 4 during the early hours of May 20th. The cause was listed as cerebral edema, compounded by prolonged hypoxia and severe hypothermia. He was only 35 years old. He did everything right, and it still wasn't enough because someone else decided his oxygen was theirs. Out of all the climbs I've covered in this channel, this honestly might be the one that has made me the most angry. The budget expedition's oxygen records showed inconsistencies that were never explained. Nikolai Voronov summited and descended safely. He declined to comment. From what I gathered, witnesses placed a figure near the cache at a time consistent with the theft, but no identification was possible and no charges were filed. Sonam Thendu was evacuated by helicopter the following day. His ankle fractured in 2 places, frostbite claiming portions of 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 toes on his left foot. foot. The amputations ended his career as a high-altitude Sherpa, which honestly just broke my heart. The grip strength and dexterity required for rope work and ice screw placement were permanently gone. 12 summits, 15 years. It was not the altitude or the cold that took his livelihood. It was staying beside a man who could not be saved, because leaving was something Sonam Thendu did not do. Above 27,000 feet, the rules that govern behavior at sea level dissolve. Morality does not disappear. It competes against fear, against the body's demand to survive, against the knowledge that hesitation at that altitude is not measured in consequences, but in minutes of life remaining. Someone took those bottles. Whether they did it because they were desperate or because they simply could, the mountain did not distinguish. It charged the same price either way, and sent the bill to the wrong man.